Thank you, and thank you all for being here. It's a wonderful occasion. It was described as a love fest, and I think it is. I think we all loved Kent, and he deserved our love. He was an amazing human being. Let me just say, from the offset, the slides are a little saturated, so kind of, and if you have the ability to kind of bring them down a little bit on that saturation dial, do that in your head. Okay, well, thanks so much for coming. Let me change glasses here. Thanks so much for coming. And thanks to Kathy for organizing all of this, keeping the flame alive. We all loved Kent, and we were all thankful for these get-togethers. They keep him with us. For this presentation, I'm going to begin at the beginning with some pictures of Kent and Kathy and their dogs and horses and cats, and the first meeting I had with Kent then some talk about the initial work we did together, freezing out on the prairies in Yuma, photographing the cover of Eventide and getting to know each other. Then the exploratory changes of West of Last Chance, how we worked together, the publication of the book, and the great time we had promoting it. And throughout, I'll show some of the pictures from the book and read the words that Kent wrote. So here are some home photos to start you off. Oh. Kent told me to keep photographing. That's one of the sweetest dog photographs I've ever seen. Those are sort of Kent Haruf soulful eyes, not that I look at them. And Kent and his wonderful horses. And Kent out on the plains. A student once described me as a Yankee going out west and come down south, and I am. But for whatever set of reasons, I've been fascinated by the flatlands and the high plains of the American West since I was a kid. I actually went to a therapist once, many years ago, years into my plains work, to see if I could discover what this was all about. And the man simply quoted a line from the poet Rumi, "Don't question enthusiasms," he said. And he smiled at me and sent me on my way, $150 poor, but it was worth it. And it was just about this time that I read Plainsong. It had come out in 1999, and I immediately knew that things were going to get a lot more complicated. I had to meet this Kent Haruf. I hadn't read his other novels, but I quickly did. There was something about the clarity of his tone, the affection he had for his characters, and the influence the land and the small towns he wrote about had on his sensibility that seemed very familiar to me and true. I've been photographing this country for 20 years at that point, and I felt that there might be a kinship between the two of us. We seemed to be doing the same sorts of things in different art forms, though Kent had been at it his entire life. Little did I know. I first met him at Brazos bookstore in Houston, where he gave a reading from Plainsong. He had the flu, but still was impressive in his thought, his way of speaking, his calm, his confidence, and his utter lack of pretension. Plus that sly humor. He was smart, he was wise, and he was very funny. And he could write. He was exactly the person I had hoped him to be, a match to his words. And this still holds true, I think, even after he's passed on. If you want to get to know Kent, all you need to do is read his books. And this is not always the case with writers. I also like the fact that he was wearing a regular old green work shirt with his t-shirt showing at this cultured event. And that knocked me out. He didn't need props. He seemed to know exactly who he was. I remember years later on a book tour for West of Last Chance, we were put up at a swanky hotel, the Zaza in Dallas. And after 3 days of canoeing on the Llano River in the Texas Hill Country, we rolled into the bar about 2 in the afternoon, famished. We were both filthy, wearing ball caps and squinting in the darkness. We went up to the bar, and the guy behind the counter said, "You guys look like farmers." And Kent looked at him and said, "We're not farmers, we're rock stars." And the man laughed and brought us some food. But back to Brazos. Plainsong was the best book I'd read on the plains, and I'd read a lot, both contemporary and historical, fiction and nonfiction. And I thought his writing not only perfectly described the High Plains, but that the book transcended regionalism. When I came down to it, Plainsong simply was one of the best novels I'd ever read. And it seemed that we had a similar take, not only this part of the world, but on life itself. So I gave him a copy of my newly published book on the plains, and he was touched, and we spoke briefly, and he proceeded on with his book tour with his editor, the great Gary Fiskett-John. A week or so later, I received a wonderful letter from Kent praising my book, and we began a correspondence and a conversation that stopped only at his death. Plainsong got rave reviews, as you all know, went on to become the finalist for the National Book Award, and was a huge bestseller. And these are Kent's words. When you look at this country, it makes you want to believe in a New Testament benign God. And this is a photograph of a whiteout. And then this. And this has been quoted, and it's from West of Last Chance, and it's just wonderful. You have to know how to look at this country. You have to slow down. It isn't pretty, but it's beautiful. Kent's prose is lucid. Whether it's a sentence in a novel, a line in West of Last Chance, or a description in an email, or for that matter, a public conversation, as you all saw earlier today, he was a remarkably articulate man, and he carried his words with him, and he made them count. He was very careful with them. But then there's the magic of creating the stories, and that is true wizardry, alchemy, it seems to me. I don't know how he did it. He did try to describe it to me a few times, and it seemed that a novel just came to him, a bit of it anyway, or a line or a character, and he held this narrative and his characters in his head for a time and then just began to write. And as you know, write blindly, as has been described, with a watch cap pulled down over his eyes so the narrative would spin without restraint. He actually told me that he was worried that this watch cap story would be a line in his obituary. And he jokes about it occasionally, and lo and behold, it was. The first damn line in the New York Times obit was, quote, Kent Haruf pulled a wool cap over his eyes when he sat down at his manual typewriter each morning so that he could write blind. And I discovered the last time I saw him that this cap was orange. Though there were probably others, I'd always thought that it would be blue, but the orange may have been a nod to his beloved Denver Broncos. Broncos orange being a more emphatic color than Broncos blue, and he did like that word, emphatic. And this from Kent, his words, describing from his point of view the beginnings of our working relationship and our friendship. He also describes some of my photographic method here and some embarrassingly nice stuff about me. He was so generous with his affection for so many. He had such a love for life, and we all were the recipients, through his writing, his attention to us in conversation, and through the close friendships we developed over the years. He could be sharp and condemnatory of those things he disapproved of, and there was always a lot of that available. He was courageous, both politically and personally, standing up for those things and those people he believed in, but his default always seemed to swing towards openness and affection and curiosity. So again, here's from Kent, his words. After the reading at Brazos that night, Peter gave me a copy of his book, On the Plains, and it's such a beautiful book, the best collection of photographs I know that shows the part of the world I know best and care most about. He has an eye for the narrative picture, the telling detail, the beauty in the ordinary, and best of all, he gives us the plains without condescension or sentimentality. I had his book of photographs in mind when Gary and I began talking about the jacket for Eventide. I wanted a photograph of a little town on the high plains in northeastern Colorado, showing the town from a slight rise, at a short distance, just at twilight, when the street lights had come on, a picture showing this little town at dusk, the lights shimmering and still the great expanse of flat land visible around it, and the wide, high vault of infinite sky darkening above it. I called Gary and asked him about using something from Peter Brown. He agreed, Peter was interested, and so the arrangement was made, and I met him out in Yuma on the eastern plains of Colorado after he'd been there for a day. He'd already found his way around, met some interesting folks, heard some stories, and already begun photographing. He and I were together the next few evenings. I stood around while he took pictures every 5 minutes, with his great old wooden heavy encased German camera, making the adjustments he needed, poking his head under the black cloth, pointing out certain details about the sky and the light. It was a great time for me, watching a professional at work, talking and getting acquainted while he went about his craft, making skillful pictures. One of the additional bonuses for me was that Peter turned out to be a hell of a nice guy. I thought the same of him. I was able to introduce him to some of my friends there in that part of Colorado. There was one especially satisfying night in a bar on the highway in Yuma. Some of the ranchers and farmers in the bar got to looking at his book of photographs, and they liked it so well, they wanted to buy copies for themselves. I think Peter was pleased by that. I was. To have men who had known that high plains country for all their lives, who had lived on it and worked on it for years, in all its changes and all its various weathers, to have them approve of what he showed about it without being fancy or cute. It was the approval of the ultimate experts. I don't believe for an artist there's any higher praise. And I agree with that. It was the best review I've ever had. And back to Kent. It turned out once the negatives were developed and the twilight picture I'd hoped for was not nearly as good as the picture that was 2/3 plum sky with a band of orange under it, a distant outline of the little town, then in the foreground a dark fallow field, and below that a band of rust-colored native grass. I think it makes an awfully fine photograph for a book jacket. This is what you have seen. During the making of that photograph, there was a lot of time standing around, as Kent says, and it quickly became clear that we had much in common. Both of our fathers were ministers, Kent's Methodist, mine Presbyterian. We never in our long friendship stopped poking at each other about the less than stellar religious upbringing the other had had as a kid. We both had been English majors, had similar tastes in literature, politics, and humor. And honest of all, that first night we were dressed identically, same gray flannel, fleece, same black shirt, same blue jeans, and we even wearing the same Timberland boots, same brand, same model. It was very weird. And we both acknowledged the other's good taste in clothes. But the differences were there too. Kent's father had moved family every 5 years from one small plains community to the other, as is the case with the Methodist Church, while my dad was more of a theologian and I grew up in academic surroundings. And as we talked out there in the cold and in bars and restaurants and took photographs, a number of which ended up in our book, West of Last Chance, it became apparent that there might be the possibility of doing something more, and we decided to stay in touch. Back in Houston, this was the fall of 2004, I remembered hearing about the Dorothea Lange Paul Taylor Prize given by the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke, an award that gives seed money and attention to writers and photographers working collaboratively. On the Plains had been published by the center in conjunction with Norton, and staffers there had asked me to apply in the past. I thought about it and got in touch with Ken. So here's an excerpt from a letter I wrote him October 25th, 2004. Dear Ken, ever since leaving Yuma, I fantasized about working on something with you. A series of photographs with text, a small book, something. And so what has begun to move slowly into my mind is just such a thing, some sort of collaborative effort on that part of the High Plains that represents my work and yours. I have no idea what this might mean, or if you have the slightest inclination to get involved in something like this. If the Lange Taylor Prize gives seed money and the prestige would be nice and national, it would give impetus to such a project. The main reason, apart from getting up into that wonderful country again, is that it would be fun to get together with you, meet Kathy, see Salida, and get your informed take on the part of the world I'm obsessed with, the flat, rolling lands off to your northeast. It's country that I love, and it would be quite an education for me to discuss it with someone who knows it as well as you do, someone who could also point me to people and places which otherwise might be closed off. My thought would be for the two of us to get together to talk about this if you're interested, the shape of the book, places to go, how a mix of imagery and words might work, and then I'd go off and do some photography, with perhaps a trip or two with you if you had the time, and then we'd get together and look at photographs and talk some more. The mix of photographs and words has been of interest to me for a long time, as you know, and I think we might be able to make some new forays into this still somewhat unexplored realm. So let me know if this has any interest for you. Okay, and let me do a couple more Kent pieces. So this is from Kent. The little girl in a pale blue summer dress riding an old bicycle on the dirt streets. Behind her, the trail of loops and scallops from her tires in the dirt. And this. There were some Russians came over here one time, back in the 1970s, during when it was still the Cold War, some kind of goodwill agricultural exchange. Well, they got to talking, and it turned out they'd never driven a car before. Wanted to try it one time. So we took them out in Lloyd's new Lincoln, out in one of those sandhill pastures. Figured they'd be safe out there. Those Russians just tore the living shit out of that car. The undercarriage and everything. There was a vodka bottle involved, I believe, passing it back and forth. Anyway, Lloyd, he never could get that car to track right afterwards. Tried to collect from the government for damages, but that never went anywhere. It was a case of hands across the sea. It was a pure case of ask not what your government can do for you. That's about the best whirly gig I've ever seen. And after I sent my letter, I got a call from Kent, and he wanted to explore the idea, and we did, and we agreed fairly quickly that we did want to collaborate. And we began to think seriously about what this might mean, mapping out the beginnings of a way of thinking about a new kind of book on the plains. Ken sent Duke a writing sample, and I sent photos, and we drew up a proposal, and we got to work. Let me read you a bit of the proposal, which lines up pretty succinctly what actually happened over the next few years. Kent Haruf and I plan to photograph and write about the people, land, and small towns of the High Plains. This is elevated land that originally was shortgrass prairie and home to a wide variety of animals and native people. Now it primarily supports ranching and agricultural, and its population has dwindled. Our interest in this part of the world is contemporary, but it also includes its history and a mix of stories that have passed down over the years, stories that resonate with the land in interesting ways. Our work will take place primarily in the central High Plains, the sandhills of Nebraska, south to southern Colorado, the area that Haruf has written about extensively, but other areas of the High Plains will be traveled and photographed as well. I plan to work with a large format 4x5 view camera on a tripod, as I have in the past, with color negative film, and will photograph the plains as I have done for the past 20 years. I continue to be interested in those moments that describe the beauty, the power, the tragedy, and cultural complexity of the place itself, the way the land has been used, the way that people have lived on it, and the visual record that has been left behind. Over the years, I've evolved a way of photographing that feels comfortable and natural. My method is a mix of planning and intuition, planning through the use of maps, histories, literature, conversation, small-town newspapers and the like, and intuition in that I try to be open to whatever sixth sense informs me that a photograph is nearby. I've worked on the Llano Estacado of Texas for the past 2 years, and some of these photographs may be useful for this collaboration. Kent Haruf has lived and written about the High Plains for decades and has already begun to write with his book in mind. Short prose pieces that are often visual in effect, verbal photographs in a way that have both a sense of place and a humanity that I find very moving. We've included a number of these along with a short story that contains multiple examples of this sort of writing. The idea of the book is that these short evocative pieces will move the photographs into new dimension just as the text will be transformed by the photographs. As Haruf says, I do emphatically think of these little pieces I'm writing as somehow circulating around and in the wonderful photos Peter takes of the country, as if these stories and sketches are part of the very dirt and air he gets in his pictures. The precise ways that the photographs and writing will be put together will evolve as the project moves forward. And then we decided to proceed whether we got the award or not. So I shipped him up photographs that I had done recently on the Llano Estacado, and Kent sent me small bits of writing, pieces that were evocative of the plains, the place, its history, human relations, weather, current issues, overheard remarks, wonderful and multi-dimensional bits of writing that often were very visual. And then I flew up to Denver, and as I had done many times in the past, and we began to travel together and work on a visual literary narrative that would join our images and texts. And then the phone calls, the emails, my own travel, more travel with Kent, the laying out of text and photographs in hotels and conference rooms in many small plains towns, and lots of talk. We were also helped by people who Kent knew in Yuma. Tom Parks, the town vet, drove me all over the area repeatedly, and Raleigh Deering, a local rancher, took me out past fence lines and into fields where cattle were grazing. These two particularly opened doors to local people, and the book began to take form. And this is from the afterword that Kent wrote for the book, the only words of description in West at Last Chance. We went out onto the High Plains together, and we made a beautiful image of a little town at dusk in northeastern Colorado. That was the beginning of our close friendship and the start of our collaboration on this book. We met in eastern Colorado and ranged out from there, driving across the great flat treeless country, looking at the open pastures and the wide stretches of farmland, driving around in the familiar little towns, turning onto the main streets and heading up the back alleys, talking to people and listening to them, and always looking at the way the light fell on everything, seeing again and again how everything stood up so precisely and cast such shadows in that clear light. We met for a number of days that way, at varying seasons of the year, and Peter spent many days on his own, working out in the country with his big camera. During this period of planning and collaboration, we talked on the phone 50 times and wrote back and forth any number of times, and gradually we arrived at an ordering of the prose and the photographs that we believed was both logical and evocative, arriving at a book we hoped that would show as clearly as we felt it our deep and abiding, unsentimental affection for the High Plains and its various people, out of our years of our experience of this exact place in America, and out of our hours of thought and our wonder about it. And now some more photographs, some words from Kent. They were walking out of a room on the way to the bar when Frank saw another man standing off against the wall. Frank went over and slugged him, bringing it all the way from the floor. The man slid down the wall like they do in movies. George said, "What in the hell did you do that for?" "Oh, I've been wanting to do that for 23 years, Frank said, and I just couldn't put it off any longer." And this, across the alley, a roofing crew is shoveling the old shingles off the roof of the flower woman's house. Bandanas around their heads, dirty, sweaty, big bellies, smoking, the shingles filthy, clattering and fluttering to the ground, dirt and the smell of dirt in the air. All this while on their radio certain 1950s songs play. Little Darling, and I Like Bread and Butter, I Like Toasted Jam. We did receive the Lang-Taylor Prize, and let me read an excerpt from a letter that I sent Kent that describes this. The letter was enclosed in a box of photographs. May 9th, 2005. Dear Kent, here are the proofs from the last trip up to Yuma. All the work here is from the Yuma area, and in some I was thinking about specific pieces of yours, a practice that I'm not sure is something I want to continue in the conscious way I was doing. I think it may be best just to photograph and see how the images and words go together once we've got them assembled. There are some here that I think may work. There's a series on various Native American battleground massacres that I think may work well in a sort of spacey spiritual way. Yet when I think of the shots of Benny Clausen and his family with all the arrowheads, that kind of connection, which did not occur to me when I was photographing, that may work the best. Anyway, I think this trip I'm just going to shoot with a blanker mind and see where I end up pointing the camera. But if I run into another cafe like Mom's in Otis, I'm sure I'll be thinking of weed killers. More on that in a second. Feel free to mark up the proofs any way you want, and if any of them inspire thought or story, obviously feel free to write something down. I'm not discouraging an idea of one-to-one correspondence, I'm just making an argument for magic and the unconscious. Well, at this precise moment in time, I just got a call from Alexa Dilworth at Duke letting me know that we have won the Lang-Taylor Prize. What a wonderful bit of news. It's the Bucks, of course, but it's also a great send-off to the book and the project in general. I think it will help the book get out there, and of course it's a big morale boost as well. I can't thank you enough for being a part of this. I think it will continue to be fun, and I very much look forward to the entire process. Wow, what great news. And now Jill has just phoned, and her mammogram is fine. Jill is my wife. And now I'm going to call my mom. And now you've just called, and we've spoken about all this. What a great day. I'll be in touch with you about it all soon. And here are the two pieces I just spoke about. They rode out to Fort Lyon from Denver and went into camp and ate and rested and then rode on all night so that they would be in place on the bluff above Sand Creek to begin to murder at dawn. They shot men and old men and rode them down, but mostly they killed women and children and teenagers without mercy. In the afternoon of the following day, they pillaged among the tents in the village, collecting things, and went about desecrating and hacking the bodies, and afterward burned everything remaining. About a month later, they rode back to Denver and made a parade along Larimer and Blake Streets behind a regimental band And in the evening, some of them displayed scalps and other mementos, stepping up onto the stage between the acts of the drama being presented at a Denver theater to an appreciative and enthusiastic audience. The people they murder were the Cheyenne, led by Chief Black Kettle, and a smaller group of Arapahoes, led by Chief Left Hand, who all understood themselves to be in the place a representative of the U.S. government had told them to be and to be waiting for further orders. The murderers were led by a Methodist preacher come cavalry officer named John Chivington. This massacre was perpetrated in 1864 on the 29th of November. The Cheyenne and Arapaho people never recovered from it. Now, these many years later, they hold tribal rights entitled to no land in Colorado, their one-time home between the South Platte and Arkansas River. So this is actually Sand Creek massacre spot. It's the Michael Barrow family at Wounded Knee. And that's the Crazy Horse Monument referred to earlier in the background there. That was a black powder reenactment. They didn't want me to take the photograph because the Adidas shorts were not time specific. And that's Benny Clausen with all of his point collection. That went on for another room, and apparently he was offered $250,000 for it from the Smithsonian and turned him down. Oops. We were in Shattuck's Cafe, middle of the morning, sitting at a table against the wall. It's one of those places where they bring you biscuits and gravy with every breakfast order unless you tell them not to. And my wife was talking, but I was paying more attention to what the three men at the next table were saying. They had on orange vests, worked for the highway department apparently, taking their morning break, and at one point, I can't recall now what had prompted it, one of them said to the other two, "We may not be the smartest sons of bitches in the world, but we sure can kill weeds." Okay, and this from me. And a year or so after this, after a lot of work, a lot of travel, a lot of bad food and nasty motels, after long drives together in which we talked and talked and talked, our talented agent, Nancy Stuffer Cahoon, sold the book to W.W. Norton after a dual presentation to Norton and to Knopf. Our travels together for the book were in Colorado, and our promotional tour for the book included Texas and Utah as well, and we put on many miles. For the book, we made trips to the Yuma area together, and then a number down to Lyman, which seemed a representative place with a lot of small towns nearby, and a wonderful open country surrounding it. We also just drove around, and I included photographs from some of my earlier travels to other High Plains states. Throughout the process, we rented separate motel rooms. Kent had sleep apnea and needed a special machine, and one memorable day in Lyman, he scored the honeymoon suite at the First Inn Motel, which not only featured an in-room hot tub, but also the biggest bed that either of us had ever seen. And on this gigantic, what seemed to be octagonal bed, the final sequencing of West of Last Chance took place. The room was filled with happy and compliant spirits, and the words and images went together easily. The book then began to include two remarkable people who had since died. Our editor, Jim Mars, the legendary head of visual books at Norton for over 30 years, a man who we both came to love and revere, and an equally legendary Carol Hout Smith, a poetry fiction editor at Norton, whom Kent had the highest regard for. She suggested a change of only one word in all of Kent's writing, and Kent accepted it, although with some reluctance. It had to do with snakes dropping rather than dripping onto a bed from a dirt ceiling in a dugout. She didn't think that snakes could drip. Kent maintained they could. He finally took her edit, but brought it up with me a number of times, shaking his head. She raised his spirits later in the day when she took us to a fancy restaurant near the Norton offices and referred to the black-clad waiters as the Viet Cong. And from, this is the, there was a young couple from Ohio, from Kent, came out here homesteading with a little new baby. Poor, they didn't have much of anything. They staked a claim and dug a dugout onto the side of a hill for a home with an old coat hung across the opening to keep the sun out and maybe some of the flies. Around them there was not a single tree anywhere for miles. So he had to go on west to the mountains with another man to cut firewood for their use in the winter, a 3-day one-way trip by buckboard. He was just gone 2 days when she came inside and discovered rattlesnakes were dripping down out of the dirt ceiling into the baby's crib, where the baby was asleep in the hot afternoon with a soft cloth covering him. She stifled a scream in her throat. She managed to do that and tiptoed up to the crib and stood and watched and breathed and bent over very gradually, very carefully, took up the baby and stepped back away. Then, without having to think about it, she wrote a brief note and put it on the little table with a rock over it to hold it down. "Gone home," it said. And I did just change dropping to dripping. Katie Holm is a wonderful woman, and in my mind, the best photographic book designer in the country, a woman who had created numerous Museum of Modern Art and Whitney catalogs, produced what we thought was the perfect design for West's Last Chance. Norton spared no expense with any of this, and the book was printed in Mondadori, in Verona, and Italy. During this time, Kent and I traveled to New York a couple of times, staying at the Algonquin Hotel, the legendary literary gathering place. We got the author's discount. And it was here that I first had the opportunity to witness Kent in front of a televised Denver Broncos football game. Some of you may have seen his remarkable transformation for yourselves. He could not sit down, and up to this point in our relationship, his language had been colorful, but certainly controlled. Suddenly he was up on his hind legs, screaming at the TV at one motherfucker wide receiver after another. Pointing, spinning around, belittling coaching moves, slapping himself on the forehead. It was a revelation, and it put a new twist on our conversations. Freed them up, you might say. There's a bottomless well of profanity festering deep in the soul of each Methodist or Presbyterian minister's kid. And we explored it. The worst was when Kent and his brother Mark and I got together on road trips. Every other word or phrase seemed to be creatively obscene. But enough of this. Let me, got 3 short, sweet pieces here. I remember when I first brought you in here. You turned, and there was a kitchen window where you could see all this. After a while, you turned again, and then the look on your face, I remember. An old man told me people were so hungry for music back then, if a man was a good whistler, they would gather around in the evening and listen to that. She was an old woman, lived her life and died, and there was no one ever said she was pretty, let alone beautiful. They buried her out of the north corner of Holt County, across the fence from Otis Murray's dryland cornfield. Her spirit, who can say, perhaps it found someone in the hereafter to love it. Pay it some attention. Let me talk briefly about our process. I had a good number of Kent's text in mind as I photographed, of course. And as I said before, every time I had a sense that an image or a series of images that I was working on would jive perfectly with the text, I was wrong. Ultimately, there's only one shot in the book, other than the photograph of the Sand Creek Massacre site, that I took from Kent's text in my conscious mind, and that's of a hog farm. All the rest were arrived at separately. I would photograph, Kent would write, we would get together and as a team move the words and images around like a mosaic. We tried hundreds of different combinations. In some cases in the book, the text and words seem an easy mix. They go together in obvious kinds of ways. In others, there is more of a stretch. In some, there is a series of images that take the text in new directions, and in a few, the image or images run counter to the text itself. We trusted the reader to make these connections for him or herself. We decided early on that we did not want an introduction, no explanation for how the book was to be dealt with. We wanted the reader to take it at face value and work his or her way into it. And we came up with a narrative arc. The book has 5 sections, and with each section, while relating to the others, has a specific set of things that it's dealing with. And this is from Kent in The Shape of the Book in his words. If you're expecting to see Aspen or Long's Peak or something, that's not what this book is about. The book is about slowing down and finding what is of value and significance once you've done that. So it begins with the land, then it moves into Native Americans. We start with the massacre at Sand Creek and the beautiful photographs that give it a kind of a modern uptake on that. Then it touches on some of the devastation that has been done to the land, and then there's a sort of a lyrical entry into towns. It's as if we're coming in from outside into town, what it looks like from a distance. It closes by going to church, talking about church suppers. We thought it would be too soft and sentimental to end in church, so it pulls away from that and ends back on the land. There's an arc, but there's also a kind of a circle. And now, me again. In many ways, it's a difficult book. We hope that it would not be dealt with as a reader might expect. A series of photographs about the plains and these coupled with captions. Like the country, we hoped it would take some time to work into the book and understand it. Our idea from the beginning was to confound expectation. Although the pages of photographs outnumber the pages of text, as I've said, our idea was that the resonance of the words would pervade the book in ways that would merge the stories into the images that followed. We knew well that pictures remain in one's mind as one turns a page, reading, looking, considering, and that words also produce images. There's a mix here that is finally uncontrollable, but becomes dynamic. The book is a genuine collaboration, and our idea was always that the text and images would be given equal weight by the reader. And now more from Kent. Dark clouds. You hope for rain and no hail. For rain and no hail and no wind. If there is hail, it is pea-sized and little of it. If there is hail and marble-sized, that it misses you. If there is hail and marble-sized, that it lands on the fallow field north. The idea of golf ball-sized hail, you don't even allow. You hope for rain, though. People have asked about our titles. Kent and I were heading east in Colorado, driving along US Highway 36, casting around for ideas. We needed a title, obviously, and each of us had thought of a number of them. None of them seemed to work well. The best we had come up with was the correction line, which is a topographic term having to do with the gridded nature of the plains. Almost all of the roads run true north, south, or east-west, but given the curvature of the earth, if you continue straight, you don't actually end up at the pole. You end up off to the side. So every 24 miles, there's a shunt to the side known as a correction line. Why this appealed to us, I'm not sure, but I'm glad we didn't use it. We did want some sort of warning in the title, though. The plains are not in great shape, as everyone knows. Dwindling towns, the overuse of pesticides, fertilizer, and chemicals, a terrible depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer, a history of genocide in relation to native peoples, industrial hog farms, chicken farms, feedlots, etc. And we rolled right through the little town of Last Chance. And we turned and looked at each other. Last Chance. We were suddenly east of Last Chance, heading for a little house on a very wide prairie. And the title East of Last Chance jumped out at both of us. And we fiddled directionally with that thought for a while. West seemed more hopeful than east, we thought, and less like east of Eden. So we decided pretty much right then and there, west of Last Chance. As for Kent's writing, some of the pieces are made up. Some of them have some basis in real life. And a good number are stories that Kent overheard or had people tell him, and some he experienced for himself. And now, from Kent. People from Denver came out here and put cream-colored stucco on an old clapboard house to look nice and believed they would raise buffalo. Believed they could. Called them bison. So they put barbed wire fences around a pasture. In the first good breeze, those buffalo took off, and they didn't get them stopped until they got to the correction line about 8 miles north. Oh, people will try anything. Our intentions for the book were varied. It's funny in parts, laugh out loud funny as far as I'm concerned, and it speaks of the past as well as the present, but there's a political content to it as well, both historic and contemporary. It's a commentary on life in these little towns and on the plains themselves, and by extrapolation, we hoped, to wider American culture. But perhaps for me, more than anything, it continues to be an exploration, a trip out into that wonderful country, a place I never tire of visiting. There's a wonderful secret as well, and one of the reasons I personally wanted to publish this book and my earlier work on the plains was to share that secret. Most Americans have no idea, although you people do. They think of the plains as boring, as flyover country, as part of the world to get through as quickly as possible. In fact, it's a resonant place. The mantra for West of Last Chance, as Kent wrote, and you've heard a number of times, you have to know how to look at this country. You have to slow down. It isn't pretty, but it's beautiful. These are the words that set the tone, I think, for all the rest. The high plains are a beautiful and confounding part of the world, a place where you can feel as though you're on top of the earth, the equivalent of Everest, and 2 days later or 10 minutes later feel as though you're the most insignificant thing ever to live. There's a quiet beauty, a scale of space that exists nowhere else, a set of colors and a quality of light that I've come to love, and a subtlety that merges with grand space in a way that for me is intoxicating. I love being out there. I love those struggling, tenacious little towns. I've come to have great respect and affection for the people I've come to know, and it's a nice thing to share. The high plains keep the mind hopping, from serenity to history to anguish to community to splendor. It's a fascinating part of the world, and I was privileged to share it with many people, most particularly Kent. And here are a few more pieces from our book and words from Kent. It seems to me nothing man has done or built on this land is an improvement over what was here before. And what follows is an excerpt from a beautiful longer piece that Kent wrote, that lyrical trip into town that he described earlier. But at night it was different. At night what you saw were the far lights in a cluster, the lights of town, the street lights showing bluish bright from a distance. Sometimes if you were on a rise, you could see them from a distance of 30 or 40 miles. But listen, there was this butte, Ransom's Butte, out west of town, from which at night you could see the lights of Holt and 4 other towns, one of them at a distance of 70 miles. Can you imagine a place with air so clean and thin and an atmosphere so dry and the land so flat that the far lights driving in from a distance, that's what you saw at night. They made you feel glad. They were beacons by which to gauge your progress towards some place you wanted to be, so that in time you came to love the way the lights of the town looked at night from far out in the country, even if you would never use the word love to express it. Oh, not that they were arranged in the most aesthetic or most artistic way possible, but simply because you had grown up with them just as they were, precisely that way and no other, so that that particular configuration came to hold the feelings of place. And all you thought about it and knew about it, and about how you felt going there, about arriving there late at night in the middle of summer after you had been away, about getting out of the car in front of the quiet house and rubbing the back of your neck for a moment, and stretching and looking up at the high white stars and then noticing the trees, how there was a little wind breathing in them high up, moving the high branches, and then going in towards the house and walking up the front steps, the sound your shoes made on the wood planks and the quiet, and then on across the porch, and then what felt like opening the door, and that sad little melancholy noise the door always made when it swung open, and oh, that old smell coming out to you, familiar and distinct. And so moving on, entering the house, you were aware of that cool, dark sanctuary of peace in the quiet rooms, where once again you were at home, and you knew that, and you felt it completely, even if all you said was, "Are you ready to go up to bed? It's getting pretty late." It's a golf course. That's been changed to one-stop burritos. And that's a museum. I don't know if you can read the little sign there. And now this, sweet please. These are the Browns of Rushville, Nebraska. And she had just turned 89 and he was 91, and they were still very much in love. Then we came over the hill walking and came on this single cottonwood, and we sat down, and after a while she began to unbutton the top of her blouse, and I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "You're not supposed to talk, don't you know that?" "I won't say another word." "You're still talking." "Oh Lord, help me." She gave me a look. "But that's not talking," I said, "that's praying." Then she had her blouse off under the tree in the dappled shade, and I went speechless. The way she looked, the sun freckling on her shoulders, it was way past even prayers. And now here's an excerpt from a long and again very beautiful piece that Kent wrote about church suppers at the end of the book. And again the preacher would say amen, and now let us all break bread together. But then there would be a kind of reluctance, a kind of polite hesitation about who should go first, until someone would say, "Mr. Barnes, why don't you start us?" And old Mr. Barnes, with his wooden cane crooked over his arm, would come shuffling forward, carrying his plate, and begin to pile the food onto it, with one of the women assisting him at his elbow. Then that earlier hesitation and reluctance would disappear. Everyone would come forward at the same time, and a line would form on either side of the serving tables, and all the people would begin to pick and choose and select and take and spoon and fork and pile the food high on their plates and make comments, the women especially, about how good it all looked and who had brought which dish. And don't you know, when she made something, it always tasted just as good as it looked. And there was all that food set out before them. Celery sticks and carrot sticks and celery sticks with peanut butter, lettuce salad, macaroni salad, 3-bean salad, coleslaw, grated carrots and raisins, and Jell-O with fruit cocktail, Jell-O with tangerines, Jell-O with bananas, Jell-O with mandarin oranges, Jell-O with cottage cheese, and deviled eggs, and casseroles, green bean casseroles with mushroom soup, noodle and cheese casseroles with potato chips on top, hamburger casseroles with brown onion rings on it, scalloped potatoes and milk sauce, scalloped potatoes and mushroom soup, and beans, baked beans with ham, baked beans with bacon, lima beans, string beans, and peas and cream, and home-baked bread, home-baked rolls, sliced bread, meat, ham, roast beef, fried chicken, baked chicken, broiled chicken, meatballs and spaghetti, macaroni and cheesecake, chocolate cake, angel food cake, upside down cake, chocolate pie, cherry cobbler, blueberry pie, lemon meringue pie, coffee, cream and sugar, and Kool-Aid, lemonade, iced tea, and water. Then everyone would have gone through the line, including the women from the kitchen who would have held back to the last, seeing that everyone had what he or she wanted before they would allow themselves to fill their own plates. Then the room would go quieter while the people ate, with only some low talking taking place, and with most of that being soft expressions of appreciations about the food, or insignificant remarks about the weather or some local happening. Then that time of semi-quiet would pass, and the noise would begin to rise again as the little kids finished eating and their parents released them from the tables, and the kids began to play again, chasing through the room, running back into the dark hall toward the restrooms and out once again in terrified glee. And after all the people had eaten their fill, and after many of the men had gone back to the serving tables for more chicken and baked beans and coffee and an extra piece of chocolate cake, maybe there would be some form of brief meeting led by the preacher And maybe for a brief while after the short meeting, there would be a period of singing from the old hymnals, closing with an almost too sweet old hymn, Till We Meet Again, that made you want to cry despite yourself. And then that would end too, and the people would begin to get ready to go home, gathering up their dirty plates and cups and silverware into a paper sack and collecting their tired children, and begin to move themselves toward the doors to go outside and up the steps into the cool night air. And out in the kitchen, the women would be washing up and putting away and tidying the kitchen once more and hanging the dampened dish towels over the counters to dry. And then the last of the women would turn off the kitchen lights. And now all the people would have started home and gone outside and have wished one another good night, good night, good night now. Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming. Questions?
Can you explain those signs?
They're wonderful signs that you see in the plains. And you can see Martin Herman. To get to his house or his farm, you go 7 miles south and then 2¼ miles east. It's just all gridded up. And that's one of the best that we saw. They're really kind of all over the place.
Did you go to a church supper?
I've been to many church suppers. No, my father was a minister too, so yeah. I mean, the beginning of that piece I actually can't read because I just completely burst into tears. Because the minister is Kent's father, the minister's wife is Kent's mother, and the congregation is Kent's dad. And it's read it. I mean, get the book and read it. It's just absolutely gorgeous. But yeah, my church suppers were in northwestern Massachusetts, and they completely resembled the suppers in the plains. Anybody?
Can you describe your camera?
I'm sorry?
Can you talk about your camera and your choice of how you love this old German camera?
Yeah. No, I had. Do you know view cameras? And it was an old Deerdorf camera. It was. I tracked its provenance down. It was made in 1951. It's big bellows, 4x5" negative. Variety of different lenses. You always use it on a tripod. It's one of these things that you put a dark cloth, over your head, and so you set that up in any little town, and at least 3 people over the age of 75 are going to come up and ask you what you're doing, and the kids will come up and ask if they're going to be on television. So, I mean, it's an immediate way to kind of draw attention to the fact that you're photographing a little town, and it's just so visible that nobody thinks you're spying or anything like that.
Did you ever have any resistance from people?
There was one guy years ago. I was traveling with John Brinkerhoff Jackson at the time, and it was a weird photograph. It was a house that he sold canaries, and it was in South Texas, and there was this beautiful picture of a canary on the front, and I came out and I was taking a picture of it, and he came out really upset, and J.B. Jackson said that he probably has tax problems and thinks you're from the government. But early on, I photographed little kids. I mean, all sorts of things, and there were really no problems at all. Some of it has to do with the camera, but it's just such a bulky, innocent-looking thing. I mean, it was less kind of resistance. It was much more. It always has been people, kind of coming up, and then, I will ask them if there's an interesting photograph somewhere in the vicinity, and they'll send me down some, farm market road, and it won't be there, but there will be something else that'll come up that's, equally interesting. Some, octagonal barn or something.
How did the white photograph come about? How was that?
I'm sorry.
The really white photograph, just the faint line. How did that come about?
Oh, that was, it was kind of a freak snowstorm in mid-October. And again, it was Highway 36, kind of heading out east. And it just kind of, it was there. And I remember, I pulled over, I couldn't believe it, because if in the actual photograph, there's a beautiful little blue line going across it, and you can see a couple little, telephone poles or something in the background, so it locates you. But I was under there. I mean, Kent was just, who usually completely understood what I was doing, was completely confounded. And I said, okay, all right, you think I'm photographing nothing, take a look. And he came out just goggle-eyed. Yes, I get it. And it's really one of my favorite photographs. It's the most minimal thing I've ever photographed. There was another just after that where it was the same snowstorm, and there was this dirt, and it just doesn't come across in the slide, but there's this dirt, and the dirt, there must have been some pipeline or something underneath it, and there's steam coming off of the dirt around the snow, and it's just a very kind of elemental thing. Yeah?
What's your coverage area? You were in Colorado, eastern Colorado, and Texas?
I'm sorry?
Where else were you?
Oh, I photographed all around the high plain, there's,
Were you in South Dakota?
well, for Crazy Horse, yeah.
Okay, but just you were western South Dakota.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
it's pretty, I'm interested in the high plains, so it's everything from the Canadian border, down to the Staccato in Texas on both sides. But, I mean, there was a lot of work from Colorado in this book. And it was just, it was so much fun traveling with Kent. There are two people I could photograph with. My wife, Jill, who has a great eye and is content to sit and, make notes and things, while I'm photographing off to the side, and really has come up with some great suggestions. And Kent, and he, again, sort of, first, didn't get in the way, and two, was a huge help, just in terms of pointing things out, and then talking about them afterwards, or alternative pictures, that sort of thing.
You said at first he wasn't prepared?
I'm sorry?
You said at first he wasn't prepared?
I'm sorry.
I misunderstood.
No, go ahead.
Did you say at first he wasn't prepared?
First, he wasn't.
You said first he wasn't a barrier?
He wasn't the what?
Barrier.
I'm sorry.
Barrier.
Oh, yeah, no, to have somebody in the car that's kind of yakking around and kind of getting in the way of what you're doing. The fact that Kent understood that I was being serious about seeing and taking pictures, that this was not, it was lots of fun. He was talking, all the rest of it. He was, or they go, people can point out things that you have absolutely no interest in, and then you go back as you can take the picture.
Can you remind me, did you guys just get in the car and start driving, or did you have specific?
Sometimes we just go and here we were, and head off to Lyman, and there were a couple of hotels in Lyman we stay at, and we'd go to Yuma. But I mean, other times we would just take off and end up where we ended up.
In the picture you had with the field, where you're talking about the corner issue, what is it, corner? Anyhow, there was a road and some grass and then this plowed field. And down at the end of that, in the field, looked like a circle of dirt in the air.
What? Oh, that was, I call that my Dick Cheney photograph. I mean, it looks like a shotgun. And it was one of those, a tree that was completely packed with, blackbirds or starlings or something. And a car, and we were watching it, and then the car would go by and it would go off. And so I got quite excited about this and set up the tripod, and waited about 20 minutes for the pickup truck to come along. And it came along, and they just, 400.
It looked like a circle.
Yeah, no, that's it. Yeah. Anybody? Okay. Well, all right, one more.
Will you say a little bit more about the process because unlike a lot of books, there's not this sort of direct, obvious correlation between the text and the photo. sometimes a kind of a stretch, there's sometimes sort of an invitation in.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that came about for you and how you perhaps let go of a favorite photograph and that kind
Yeah.
of a give and take.
Right.
I'm
No,
just fascinated by that.
again, you know, we sort of wanted to confound expectations.
Yeah.
And so we didn't want to make these kind of direct, easy things. And we really did think of moving into this book in the way that, you know, some more novice person than people in this room might move into the little roads and towns of the High Plains and have to really contend with what they were seeing, you know, for the first time. And so to make it kind of a puzzle, to make it difficult, not to make it easy was the way to do it. In the same way that you're trying to interpret landscape when you're traveling around, you're trying to interpret this book. But there, I mean, there's some that were just kind of bang on 1, 2, and others that anyway, it's a mix of. Okay, how about more?
Were there any times when you didn't disagree?
I'm sorry, I can't.
Were there any times when you didn't agree with each other, you and Ken?
When you didn't agree.
No. It was really kind of amazing. I mean, in the same way with Mark, I think, that there was this kind of connection that we really agreed on just about everything. And he had a great eye for photographs. I mean, not just seeing where a photograph might be, but an actual photograph. And he had obviously a good feel for narrative and poetic narrative as well as kind of literal, fictional narrative. So we really worked quite easily, quite well together. It was a dream situation as far as I'm concerned. I've never had anything quite like it. My first book, Seasons of Light Out There, is a mix of my sort of hyper-imaginative writing and interior photographs. And I kind of gave that up and began to work with other writers rather than me. And here, you know, moving towards the end of my creative life, I decided that I really want to reincorporate writing with my photographs. And so I've just now, there's a book on Texas that I did, came out last year with another writer, a journalist named Joe Hawley. And I really enjoyed that. It was a little bit like working with Kent, but it was kind of a pale comparison. But I began writing about a specific photograph that had a lot of personal meaning to me and family history as well. And that spurred me on to another photograph and wrote about that, which referred both to the photograph I had just written about and jumped to another one. And so it's kind of hopscotching around. And you know, I've got this vast archive of photographs that I've never used. And they're all there. And I mean, we're talking about digital, right? And suddenly they're all, you can just click on them and they pop up and here they are. And I'm writing about them and having a very, very good time. So, yeah. I miss getting on the road and being out in the High Plains. I do miss that. Anybody else? Sorry for all this sweating. I've got this horrible condition, and there's nothing I can do about it. It just drives me crazy.